All right, we are here at the end of June, beginning of July-ish area on the liturgical calendar. Our ordinary time started a couple weeks ago, and we are, I think we're on the second, yes, we're the second Sunday of ordinary time. So we've got a little ways to go until Advent starts, right around the end of November, beginning of December, depending on how Sundays fall. But we chose to kind of divert a little bit from the calendar and talk about your questions that you've been submitting. So we have 4 weeks of questions, and actually, I think I overdid it last week. I got so excited with so much information, I feel like I rushed through some of them. So hopefully I can take my time today and not overwhelm things. But I hope also that it was helpful if you submitted one of those questions. Today we're going to talk about the Bible. Like, where did we get the Bible? What is it for? Who wrote it? Who compiled it? When? All that kind of stuff. All the different things about the Bible. Because the Bible is one of the most interesting books that's ever out there. And it's also one of the most harmful books that have ever been written. Because if you look at how different people interpret the Bible, there's ways to interpret the Bible where it can be misused, and it can be an attack, it can be a weapon, or it can be a thing that causes you to look inward and look at yourself and change the world. And I would probably argue that there's one of those that's correct. The Bible is meant to help us go inward and look at ourselves and look at God, and then bring the gifts that we find there out to the world to make the world a better place. But when we turn the Bible into a list of rules, a list of moralities, a list of who's in and who's out and all those things, and then we weaponize it against other people, I think we step outside of what the Bible is meant for. Although historically it's been used that way. And the interesting thing about the Bible is you can take verses in the Bible, pull them and compile them and get an image of God, and then say, this is God because I have all these verses of the Bible. And you can make any image of God you want to from the Bible by doing that. And so that's the really interesting part of the Bible. And there's so many different factions of Christianity. I think there are about 33,000 different Christian denominations in the whole world. So there's a lot of different ways to look at the Bible, or look at God, or look at salvation, or look at humans. And so the Bible is this book that's been given to us, and there's a lot of different ways that we could use it, look at it, read it. Some of you probably just get overwhelmed when you look at the Bible. You're like, yeah, I don't know what to do with that. And so you kind of skip over it. Some of you can dive in and you can get really nerdy like me, maybe. When I was a teenager, I taught myself the Greek alphabet so I could read my concordance because I wanted to just dive in. It captured my attention, and I was a nerd. And so I did that because I wanted to. And so you could do different things with the Bible. You can either be overwhelmed with it and you say, I don't really read it, I don't touch it, I don't look at it. Or you can dive into it all nerdy-like. But I just want to give us kind of an overview of where this book came from and what we're supposed to do with it. And give you some tools to actually take it on if you want to try and read something. So that we don't do this with our Bible and turn it into a weapon that we use against other people. So the first question that was submitted, how we got the Bible. So who collected all the books and put them together into the New and Old Testaments? This is a great question. Because if you've noticed, this isn't one book. There's 66 books in, this one. There's others that have more books. We're going to talk about those later. And they're divided up into Old and New Testament. There's starting in Genesis all the way through to Malachi, and then you have Matthew all the way to Revelation. So how did we get it in its present form? Did God just inspire it to be written? Someone wrote it down, and then all of a sudden they're like, here, this is from God to you, kind of a thing. Sometimes I think we treat it that way. So how we got the Bible? This is kind of a bigger question, so I divided it up into a few. And so we got, when were the books written, added? And the word here, canonized. Canonized means somebody looked at this book for the Bible and they're like, yes, let's put that one in here. If you're a Star Wars fan, you know what the word canon means. Because there are all of this lore, right? There's all of these stories. You got the original trilogy, which is good. And then you got the prequel trilogy it came after, but it comes before. I know it's confusing if you're not a Star Wars fan. And that one was all right. It was okay. And then you have the sequel trilogy that came out, I think, 2016, somewhere around there. That's episode 7, 8, and 9. And some people are like, those were bad. We should not include those in the canon of Star Wars because they're horrible. But as soon as something is introduced into what's called the Star Wars canon, it's like, all right, that's a part of the world now. So everyone has to acknowledge, if you want to write any Star Wars books or novels or graphic novels or video games or anything like that, then you have to acknowledge that these are the facts that everyone's already agreed to. So the word canon means that's an authoritative source. And so somebody looked at this, and they're like, yeah, let's put Matthew in here. We're going to make sure Matthew gets in there. And let's look at Colossians. Yeah, we like Colossians. Let's put that one in here. That, when someone looked at it and then said, that's the book that we're going to include, the word for that is canonized, or the canon. And it means like an authoritative, like, yeah, that's a good thing. So we're going to look at that question. How are the books written, edited, and canonized? That's an important question. And why were the books written, edited, and canonized? These are huge. So for the writings themselves, did you know that writing as a technology didn't exist until about 2000 to 1500 BC? There were hieroglyphics before then that the Egyptians were all about, but like the structure that we have, whereas like the A makes this sound and the B makes this sound. It's called a phonetic alphabet. That didn't exist until like 2000 to 1500 BC. So if we're thinking that this book was written when Moses was walking around, right around 1500, that would be difficult to do if writing was just invented. So a lot of people say, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that was written by Moses. Moses sat down, God spoke, and he wrote it down. But the hard part about that is they didn't really have paper, and writing was very new. So it wasn't a compiled thing yet, but these stories were rotated through all of the people. They would tell them, how you sit down by campfires and all of a sudden you're like, I got a story. I got to tell you this story. There's one time, and then you go off on a story. And it's maybe a story that you heard from your dad or your mom or your grandpa or whatever. That's called an oral tradition. Somebody probably didn't write that down somewhere. You don't have it in a book. Let me pull out my book and tell you the story my dad told me. It's an oral tradition. That one time. That's how most of the Bible was compiled. Was for 1,000 years. People just told each other these stories out loud as they sat around dinner time and whatnot. And it had different seasons that they would have, and they would recognize different religious seasons. But they would just tell each other the stories. There wasn't a book that they could go to. That happened a little bit later. So the stories of the Bible were passed down from generation to generation through this oral tradition. And the oldest story in this book is probably going to be the story of Job. And the story of Job, we don't know when it was written, but it takes place somewhere around 2000 BC. It's unlikely it would have been written before an alphabet was invented. But that's one of the oldest stories that's in here is the book of Job. So then we have this tradition that these oral stories were passed down and passed down and passed down. And so we have tradition tells us that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. But then you have an academic historical look. You can open up the books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and say, okay, so Genesis has 5 authors. It wasn't, so maybe one was Moses, but did he write all of it? Just sit down and write it all. So there's tradition tells us Moses wrote them. But scholarly stuff tells us that it had 5 authors for Genesis at least. So that tradition versus history doesn't have to influence whether or not the book of Genesis has any authority. If Moses wrote it, we're cool with that. If 5 people wrote it and somebody compiled it in a list later on, we're cool with that. We still have the book. So there's that tradition versus the history of how it was actually given to us. And then the evolution of each book of the Bible is a little bit different, but they all seem to like coalesce right around when Israel was exiled to Babylon in 500 BC. That's when they're like, we're starting to forget who we are. We're starting, because we're not in our land. We don't have our temple. We don't have our rituals. We don't have our holy city. And we're starting to forget who we are. And then the Babylonians, they have like their understanding of who God is. And they had this creation story. The Babylonians had this creation story that said there was these chaotic waters. And then like God steps in and then slays a sea monster called Tiamat. And he slices the Tiamat right in half. And then he takes half of the carcass and like slaps it down in the water. There's land. He takes the other and slaps it up and there's sky. And then he's like, you know what I need? I need slaves. And so I'll make humans. And the humans can be my slaves and serve me. And there was these other gods that were like, no, we can't do that. And they were at war. And then all of a sudden, like out of the blood of this war came humans. And that was the creation story according to the Babylonians. And you can see like the Israelites are hearing this stuff. And they're like, we believe something different, right? Like I can't remember what that was. And then someone says, I remember what that story was. You know how like there was a sea dragon and God slayed it and there was all this violence and blood and gore. Like that's not the God that we believe in. Like the God that we believe in didn't need violence. He just spoke and things happened. All he did was like speak and then land happened. And we weren't created to be the slaves of God, but we were actually created as image-bearing representatives of that God in this world. As you can see, like the book of Genesis was written to a people who were starting to forget who they were, and they're like, let's compile. We got all these stories. They've been passed down like over and over and over again. We need to put them down in a list. And somebody right around 500 BC, they're like, we need to put them all in a list so we have them all in one place because we're starting to forget who we are. And so they started to do that. And that's when we started to get like the first 5 books of the Bible written down. This is who we are. And like it's not like God was a stenographer, like telling them, okay, so the next word you need is the word the. Okay, good. Tapping that out on the stone. All right, and then the next word you need is like it wasn't. That's not how it was written. There was stories that were passed down and passed down and passed down. And one day, they're like, we need these stories in one spot. And so they got people to like write them down. You can see this in the book of Ezra. Ezra is like this scribe, and he's like, hey, I got this scroll, and I'm going to read to you from this scroll. This is who we are. And Ezra is the story of when they got to go back to their homeland and rebuild their temple and rebuild their walls and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of how the first part of that's when the first books of the Bible were edited and written, and like the canonization of the Old Testament took place later on. But that's kind of how that part took place. And how they were written was probably because Ezra, the scribe from the book of Ezra, he's like, we need to, this is important. This needs to be central to who we are. We need to remember who we are because now we're returning to our land. We're coming out of exile, and we can remember who we are and who God is and stay faithful to that. So that's the how and the when and the why that we get there. So they were trying to like answer questions like, why are we in exile anyways? Like why did we lose our land and have our temple destroyed? Was like God mad at us or something? And so the book of Deuteronomy was written. It's like, well, we were supposed to, be a people of justice. We forgot about the poor, and then God, sent this army to us, and so that's how we lost things. So that was like their early theology there. Then Deuteronomy was written, and the Kings were written from that standpoint. And they're like, well, how do we get out of here? And then we have the book of Joshua being written, the book of Ruth being written, like faithfulness to God, faithfulness to people, faithfulness to God's cause for justice and the poor and all that kind of stuff. So you can see, like, they had these questions of identity and questions of who God is, and somebody was like, we need something that's going to help guide us along. And so that's how it was kind of compiled. So, how was the Old Testament compiled? It was that. The Old Testament was, we're not really sure when it all happened, but the book of Ezra tells us that that's around 400 BC that Ezra comes up, and we're like, we need to have this book as an authoritative source. We need to have a scroll that tells us like a central piece of who we are and who God is. After the crucifixion of Christ around 33 AD, somewhere in there, like a faction of the Hebrew people, they started to build communities around a table like this one, around a meal called communion, or the Eucharist. And they're like, we don't have this temple that like actually helps us like organize us around like who we are and what we are. Now we're going to be around tables and things. The temple was destroyed around 70 AD, and right around 90 to 110 AD, they started to like have these discussions like, well, what are our books? What we have the story of Christ. They're not in the older books that we have. Who's going to write those down? So we had some people start to write down what we call the New Testament books. And the very first one from the New Testament that was written was the book of James, probably written around 45 AD, not too long after Christ's crucifixion. Then came like Galatians and the Thessalonians. Mark was the very first gospel that was written, and that was based on the teachings of Peter. Matthew was written sometimes afterwards, and it was aimed more of like at a Jewish audience. And then a lot of Paul's letters were written. So you have like Colossians, Ephesians, all those things. Like those were written to churches because they had a lot of problems going on. The Corinthians, that's a tough one. The book of Corinthians is tough because Paul is like, guys, like, no, you should not be doing what you're doing. You're just like way off here, guys. You should not be sleeping with your mother-in-law. That's actually in the book of Corinthians. That was a problem Paul had to like take on. And so that's right in there. He's like, guys, you're really like way off base here. So they were all addressed to problems within these small communities built around these tables all over the known globe at the time. Then Peter wrote some stuff, and Hebrews were written, Jude was written, and then John steps on the scene, and he's like, I'm going to write a gospel. It's like 90 AD at this point. So he writes something, then he writes the epistles, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, then Revelation was written. And each work is aimed at a specific community. Matthew is at Jews, Luke is to Romans, Mark is to Greeks, and Paul is to like these Gentile churches trying to figure stuff out. So that is like how the New Testament was written. They were just a bunch of letters sent out to a bunch of churches to address problems and help them remember things. But nobody sat down and said, you know what? Let's write a Bible. Let's write a New Testament. Like that wasn't in their minds. They're like, that Corinthian church is messed up. I need to write them a letter. Okay, I'll write it. Send it off to them. It's like sending an email kind of a thing. It's like, all right, take that to them. Like, I hope that fixes some stuff. All right, next, like Ephesus has got some problems. I got to write something to them. All right, guys, here's what you got to remember. So that's why it was actually compiled and written. But that's how it was written and why it was written. So how was the Bible then compiled? The early church, like we're talking right around 100 AD, it had a whole lot of diversity of beliefs and practices. And it made it really hard to define, like, what is a Christian? What does it mean to be a Christian? What are we about? They're like, well, these groups over here called the Valentinians, they believe this stuff. And then we have the Sethians over here, they believe this stuff. And they had all these other gospels, the gospel of Philip, the gospel of truth, the gospel of Mary, the gospel of Thomas. All of these things were written to these groups of people. And they were they were called the Gnostics, and the Gnostics were fun. They believed in this hierarchical order of human beings. Well, they said, we have the elites at the top. They got all this special knowledge. They're the ones who can really tell us what to do. And they're the ones who have the right to rule us and guide us and teach us and all that. And then we have regular old people like us, and we get to we're included in God's plan of salvation. And then we have all the people that are just concerned with all the material world, and they're just going to be annihilated one day. They're like useless. They're like NPCs. We don't care about them very much. So that was a Gnostic belief that humanity was divided up into these three hierarchies. And the church started to convene, and is that really what we're about? That was a faction of the church. And so they're like, how are we going to know what's authoritative? How are we going to know what it is that defines us and tells us who we are? And that's when they started to have the beautiful, let's bring all the council together. Let's bring all the leaders from all the churches all around, and we'll just have a big old council right around 300, in the late 300s. But something happened right around 300 AD that caused them to say, we need to sit down and come up with a list. And that was a persecution from Diocletian, who was a Roman emperor. And he started hunting down Christians, and they were starting to like collect all of Paul's writings and the different gospels. They would collect them, and they're like, we like this stuff's good. And this emperor was going around hunting them down and then burning all those books, which is one of the reasons why we don't have any of the original manuscripts of the New Testament. They're all been burned by this emperor. So he started going around on raids and finding Christians and like burning their libraries and all that kind of stuff. And Christians had to decide in that moment, what are the books, what are the letters that are worth dying for? That was the big question. They're like, if you're walking around and you have this book called The Shepherd of Hermes, they're like, do we die for this one, or do we hand that over and we're like, oh, we're all right. That one's really not that important. If you're walking around, you have the Gospel of Mark, you're like, no, this one's mine. I'm going to keep this one. So the reason that they started to compile this list early on is like, what are the books that we're willing to actually give our life for? What are the books that we think are so important? They like have so much truth in them, so much authority with them, that we would rather die than hand them over. And so they started to compile a list of those books that were the most important, that were the ones that they would be willing to die for. And this guy named Lucian of Antioch, he's the one who first came up with the 27 books that we now have in our New Testament here. That was around 310 AD. And he came up with those books, and he corrected a few errors and all that. But right around 367, Athanasius was like, all right, we're gonna bring all these together into a final piece. This is our New Testament. This is the new covenant between God and you. And then in 397, this council came together and put a stamp of approval on it. They're like, yep, those are the ones. So then we have the 27 books of our New Testament were done at that time, at that council. So we've had the book as it is, you see it here, since about 397 AD, as approved by a church council. But even before then, 310 is when the final list is like, there it is. That's when it was kind of put together. So the Council of Carthage is like, how do we know which ones are going in and which ones aren't? We're just going to like vote on it or something? So they came up with different criteria. There was 4 things that they had to meet. One, it had to have an apostolic origin. So it had to be either written by an apostle or someone who was really close to an apostle, like Mark or Luke or the writer of Hebrews. Like, we don't know who the writer of Hebrews was, but Mark wasn't an apostle, Luke wasn't an apostle, but they got in because they were close associates of Paul. And Paul was obviously an apostle, all the other apostles. So it had to be that. 2, it had to be consistent with what they called orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is not like, here's a whole doctrinal list of all the stuff you have to agree with, but orthodoxy is like properly aimed worship. So they were very concerned with, is Jesus fully divine? We talked about that last week, like the different councils and what they decided about Jesus. 2, it had to have a broad to universal acceptance across all the different churches. Like all the churches are using this one. Only some of the churches are using this one. And 4, it had to be affirmed by the Holy Spirit as inspired by God. I'm not sure how they proved that 4th one. It seems a little bit like, how do you like weigh that one? I'm not sure. But those are the 4 criterias that they adopted. And then they like threw all of the books that were available to the church through this gambit and what came out on the other side, and they voted on and said, stamp of approval, we're good to go. So if you're ever wondering, like, why did such and such book get in and such book didn't get in, it either met or didn't meet these criteria that they all agreed to back in the early 300s. So it's been a long time, 1,700 years. So there's that. All right, question number 2, the Old and New Testaments. And there was a couple of different questions about this one. Can you talk about why there are 2 testaments in the Bible? Or what is the significance of the 2 testaments? Or is it as simple as Old and New? If the Old Testament is in Hebrew and the New Testament is in Greek, then how did that transfer occur? So, fun thing. The two testaments are pretty much just separated by time. If you look at the narratives of the Bible, it starts with a creation event in Genesis and then walks us through like the calling of Abraham, the great exodus out of Egypt, the wilderness wanderings, the taking of the promised land, the kings of that land, the conquering of that land by Babylon, then they're in exile, and then they're allowed to return. And then everything kind of goes quiet in the Old Testament writings for a couple hundred years. There's intertestamental books we're going to talk about in a minute. And that's the Old Testament, kind of concluded with the prophet Micah is the last one, Malachi is in the last one. The New Testament was written by folks who believed that Jesus was the promised Messiah figure that the Old Testament talked about. Many Jews did not believe that, but then a faction of them did, and it grew to be this thing called Christianity that we have today. And they believed that God started a new covenant with the people, and it's an evolution and expansion of the original Jewish Hebrew religion called Judaism in the Old Testament. After the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, making that religion kind of geographically based in Jerusalem at the temple was really hard. So it evolved to do like synagogue style all over the place. And the church met in homes all over the place. And then it evolved to be communion, that table. They would all meet around a table for communion. So the New Testament is written by folks who believe that Jesus was the Messiah figure promised in the Old Testament. And so the Old Testament is before that, the New Testament is after that. So that's why we have two. They're separated by time. And the word testament means like contract or covenant. And so they're like, there's this old contract that God had with humans, and it worked this way. And then Jesus came, and now there's a new contract between God and humans, and it works this way. And we say that every time we have the Lord's table. This is the blood shed for you, sealing the new covenant made between God and his people. Sealed by the shedding of my blood. That whole phrasing that comes out of 1 Corinthians 11 that we speak when we have the table is that New Testament, new covenant, or new contract between God and his people. And it's a declaration that God is now concerned with the whole human race, not a specific ethnic grouping of it, and the whole world, not just the geographic center in Jerusalem. So that's a big thing that changed between Old and New Testaments. Was like the Old Testament was a calling of a people and brought to a land, and then they have a city, and then they have a temple. And then there was, inside of that covenant, this will be eventually for the whole world, that they kind of forgot about. And then comes Jesus, and he's like, we're initiating that whole world section. And the whole world, it says that it is for all of the nations. Like when Jesus in Matthew 28 says, go into all the nations and baptize those and teach them to obey all the things I have given you. Go into all the nations. The word nations in the Greek is actually ethnos, which is where we get our term ethnicity. And so Jesus is saying, go to all the ethnicities, all of the peoples, all of the tribes and tongues and nations, and invite them to the table. So that is the difference between like that Old and New Testament, Old and New Covenant kind of a thing. So, clear as mud, right? Old Testament is written in Hebrew. You can see a picture up here in Hebrew. And the New Testament is written in Greek. And Hebrew was the language of the people. There's some Aramaic in there too, in parts of Daniel and Ezra. But most of it was written in Hebrew, the Old Testament, Genesis all the way to Malachi. It's all in the Hebrew language because that was the language of the people when it was scribed down. So it's the original language. The New Testament's written in Greek because that was the language of the day when people were writing those down. Even though probably Jesus and all the people in the Gospels spoke Aramaic, probably some Latin. But people forgot Hebrew at that point because of the exile into Babylon. They forgot Hebrew, they couldn't read Hebrew. And so there's some passages where Jesus is talking to like the Pharisees. And then it says he turns to the crowd. And then he starts talking to the crowd. And then the Pharisees get mad. And the reason is because the Pharisees believed that the Hebrew language was holy. It was an elite language. And only us fancy people know how to talk and read in Hebrew and the original languages that God gave us, kind of a thing. And the rest of the people spoke Aramaic and Latin. And Jesus spoke all of those. And so Jesus will have Hebrew conversations with the teachers of the law. And then he will turn, and the people are just like, I wonder what they're talking about. It's like if you ever go to like a Catholic church and it's all in Latin. That's what you have no idea what's being said and what's going on. Like that was what people, when people talk to teacher of the law, they're talking in Hebrew. I don't know what they're saying. And then Jesus will turn to the crowds and he'll interpret. He's like, hey, these guys over here, they're saying this. And they're heaping heavy loads upon your back for they want you to carry for them. And they're not going to help you and lift a finger. And they're getting mad because they're like, you're taking this stuff that is holy in this language and you're translating it into the common language? Like, that's not cool. So the Old Testament was in this Hebrew language. It was a common language. Then it became forgotten and only a special few had it. And then they're like, no, we're the special elite people that know how to speak this language. Let's keep it. And then by the time the New Testament's written, most of the world's speaking Greek at that point. So they wrote it in the common language. So this book was always supposed to be the common tongue, the common language of the day, the common how we speak today. And I find it really interesting that there are some Christians that are like, no, the King James from 1611 is the only one that you're allowed to read. Everything else is trash. Because that's the one that God inspired. There's a faction of Christianity that believes that today, which is weird. Because if you've read the 1611 King James, it's even harder than the regular King James. It's really hard to believe. And the Bible was written in common language for common people to understand. So that's, the Old Testament was translated into Greek right around 260 BC so that more people could have access to it and read it. And it's called the Septuagint. If you ever hear that word, that's what it is. It means 70 because 72 scholars have said to have actually worked on it. And so that is why the Bible is in Hebrew and Greek with a little sparse Aramaic in there. All right, evolution of the Bible. We'd like to know your thoughts on the books and letters that are not canonized, their value, or validity and value, and the books that did make it, why are they more valid and valuable? Another question kind of in there is, do we have an understanding of why the Bible stopped growing after the New Testament? Those are really good questions. I like those questions. There are different sections we have the Old and New Testament in this common Protestant Bible, but there is something called the Apocrypha that the Catholics and the Orthodox accept into their Bible. If you've ever read a Catholic Bible or looked into a Catholic Bible, you're like, where are these books coming from? I've never heard of Maccabees. I've never heard of Tobit. Like, there's some books in there. Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, 1st, 2nd Maccabees, Baruch, and actually additions to Daniel and Esther are in what's called the Apocrypha. Then there's the Pseudepigrapha, big long word that means pseudo is like a false, and pigrapha is like writing. So they were additions that the Orthodox included. There's 3rd and 4th Maccabees and Psalm 151. But they call them pseudepigraphas because they're not actually written by the people that they said they were written by. It was a common practice. It wasn't sneaky. They're just like, I'm going to write a book like I'm Paul. Then there's the New Testament pseudepigrapha. We got the Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermes, 1st and 2nd Clement, Apocalypse of Peter, Epistle to the Laodiceans, and the Acts of Paul. Nobody includes those in the text of their canon. It's not Orthodox, not Catholic, not Protestant, not evangelical. And then we have the Gnostic texts, the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel to the Egyptians. And nobody has those included in there either. And then there's other texts like the Didache, which was an early, like, here's how we should live kind of a book, like the book of James, the book of Jubilee, and the Gospel of the Hebrews. Those are all the different writings of the time. They took all of those books, plus the ones that we have, they ran them through the gambit of those 4 criteria, and the ones that met the criteria came out. So why was the Gospel of Barnabas, or the Epistle of Barnabas not put in there? Because Barnabas didn't actually write that one, kind of a thing. Why was the Gospel of Thomas not included in there? Well, because that was written way after Thomas died, so it wasn't Thomas who wrote it, kind of a thing. Plus, it didn't match orthodoxy. It held Gnostic beliefs that the church wasn't cool with. So you can see that there were some things in there that the churches gathered in a council. They're like, That's not really who we are and what we're about, kind of a thing. So, what the Bible is a book of divinely inspired wisdom and revelation. That's what this book is. Divinely inspired wisdom and revelation. It helps aim our worship in the right direction. Orthodoxy. It aims our worship at God. It helps us order our life around proper loves. Like I love pizza, and I love my wife, and I love my dogs, and I love my kids, and I love my church, and I love this town, right? But if I start getting those orders out of whack, and all of a sudden pizza gets to the top of the list, probably not a good thing, right? So you're allowed to love certain things, but you need to order those loves in a logical order that gives you the most amount of freedom and brings the best kind of world about us. And so the Bible was written to help us order our loves so that our loves are ordered properly. And it's called orthopathy. And then it also gives us a model for living. It gives us personal ethics that are aimed at social justice. And that is orthopraxis. Those are the three things that the church wanted the Bible to kind of inspire us to do. As aim our worship in the right direction, order our loves properly, and give us personal ethics aimed at social justice. Those three things. That's what the Bible is, that's what it's for, that's what it does when it's at its best. And in the hands of somebody who knows those three things. What the Bible is not, it's not a book about what to believe and how to behave. It's not about, here's the exact, because there's 33,000 different denominations in Christianity. And that has evolved over time, and there's been factions and split-offs and things. This is not a book that's telling you exactly what to believe. It communicates a lot of mystery. It communicates a lot of ambiguity. And it's not a list of how to behave. I really liked the writings of Paul when I was younger, because it just gave you a list. Don't do these things. It's like, okay, that's easy. I can do that. Turns out I couldn't, but that's another story. But they weren't written to me as a list of moralities and ethics. They were written to a church that was experiencing problems, and he's trying to direct the community through different things. And so I have to then do some interpretive work to figure out how it applies to my life in a 21st century modern American context. And there's some stuff that has to be. It's not a life manual. You can't take the writings from an Iron Age and superimpose it upon your life and just be like, right over top. Look how nicely that fits. It doesn't work that way. It's not a how-to description. It's not like the behaviors condemned in the Bible are not an exhaustive list meant for modern day adoption, right? Like slavery is okay in the Bible. It's not okay today. But it was a product of its time. Slavery existed, and you're like, well, treat them nice at least. So we've actually grown past that kind of a thing. Patriarchy was a thing. Pillaging and raping and genocide are condoned in the Old Testament, but that's an Iron Age ethic. We're not supposed to just superimpose it over our life and be like, well, there, see, it fits. It's totally. We have a lot of things to do. This is also not a doctrinal statement. You cannot take doctrines from medieval times and then just overlay them over modern times as well. There's a lot of contextualization and work that we have to do. So you have to know the culture of the time things were written and the trajectory it puts us on, so you know how to apply it in a modern day life. So that's what the Bible is and what it is supposed to be doing for us. So I got some reflection questions for us about the Bible. What do I use the Bible for? That's a good question. What do I want the Bible to do for me? It's also a very good question to be thinking about. And the third one, what does the Bible ask of me? Now there's a totally different question. And here's a spiritual practice you can actually tackle this week. It's called imaginative reading. Read Luke 18:35 through 43. And try and see that whole scenario playing out. It's a story. And it's like try and rebuild it in your mind with your imagination. And see it happening like a movie in your mind. And then see what kind of details are sticking out to you. And then ask, where am I in this passage? Am I an onlooker? Am I a person in the actual story? Am I being interacted with? There's an imaginative reading. So you're like, wow, I don't know how to take on this book. There's a way that you can take on this book with imagination that is giving you instant access to the interior places of your heart. So you can actually read this imaginatively and try and reconstruct it in your brain, in your mind. And then just kind of reflectively look around and be like, all right, where am I in this passage and what details are standing out to me? And why do I think those things are there? It's meant for modern day reflection. So give it a try this week. Our benediction is different this week. It says this: Lord, you know better than I myself that I am growing older and will someday be old. Keep me from the fatal habit of thinking I must say something on every subject and on every occasion. Release me from craving to straighten out everybody's affairs. Make me thoughtful but not moody, helpful but not bossy. With my vast store of wisdom, it seems a pity not to use it all, but you know, Lord, that I want a few friends at the end. Keep my mind free from the recital of endless details. Give me wings to get to the point. Seal my lips on my aches and pains. They are increasing, and love of rehearsing them is becoming sweeter as the years go by. I dare not ask for improved memory, but for a growing humility and a lessening sureness. When my memory seems to clash with the memories of others, teach me the glorious lesson that occasionally I may be mistaken. And keep me reasonably sweet, for a soured old person is one of the crowning works of the devil. Give me the ability to see good things in unexpected places and talents in unexpected people. And give, O Lord, the grace to tell them so. Amen.
Please stand for our closing hymn. Great is thy